This is Dateline News and Conversation. My guest tonight, he's returning. He was with us last week to discuss part one of his article, America's Unsinkable Aircraft Carrier is Sinking. Dimitri Lascaris. Dimitri, welcome back.
Always a pleasure, Regis. Thank you for having me.
Well, you're a busy guy. You're globetrotting. Last week we talked to you in Greece, and tonight you're coming to us from Toronto.
I live in both places, not Toronto, Montreal, and I have a son who lives not far from Toronto, but I'm here for activist purposes here in Toronto today.
In other words, troublemaking. That's good.
Thank you. Anything we can do to get our message out.
There you go. All right. So, part two of a very long article that you wrote on the Israeli Hamas Palestinian conflict. The headline in part two: Israel is vulnerable to military defeat. Um, a couple of points in the next couple of paragraphs where you pointed out that many Israelis are fleeing Israel, the country,
Mhm.
and that Israelis are also fleeing settlements. Pick it up from there. How do you see Israel being vulnerable to military defeat?
Let's start by looking at the demographic situation in Israel. The Palestinians living inside Israel in the occupied territories collectively constitute a majority. Um, I think it's in the range now of approximately 52% of the entire population of historic Palestine. As human rights organizations around the world, including in Israel and the West, like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, B'Tselem, have all documented, Israel is subjecting these Palestinians to a system of apartheid. In order to do that for a prolonged period of time, you have to use brutal military repression. And the population imbalance, the size of the oppressed population is such that it presents a particularly difficult, just as a practical matter, putting aside the immorality of it, which should be obvious to any person of conscience. It becomes increasingly challenging as the population of the oppressed persons becomes larger vis-a-vis the oppressor population. And the demographic trends, even apart from the impacts of this war, suggest that this demographic challenge will become greater over time. The Palestinian population has been growing more rapidly, and now that there's a war happening, which in many respects is without precedent in the history of Israel, and the mythology of Israel's vulnerability has been shattered, as it was on October 7th, invulnerability, I should say. Um, a lot of people, I think, are reassessing, a lot of Israeli citizens are reassessing whether they, in fact, are safe in this small country, which characterizes itself as being surrounded by enemies on all sides. And just as an anecdotal piece of evidence, when I returned, I was in France visiting family um, on October 7th. I returned to Greece on October 8th, the day after this began, or it was the 9th. It was shortly after the attacks within Israel. And when I got to Athens, there were Israelis everywhere. I spent a night in a hotel in Athens. It was jam packed full of Israelis, and they weren't there for vacation, you could tell. These were people who had left suddenly, and they had brought their children with them. Then I went down to the house that I have on the southern coast in Kalamata. I went to a restaurant that I had spent. I've gone many times. Never once encountered Israelis there. There was a very large family of Israelis, three generations, grandparents, parents, children. They didn't look like they were they were there to vacation. They looked quite concerned about what was going on. And there have been widespread reports about people leaving Israel, and those who live in the border areas in particular. I think there's a serious question as to whether they'll ever return. So, just to give you one significant example, the town of Kiryat Shimona, which has had a population in excess of 20,000 people before this war, and which is very close to the Lebanese border in the north, has been completely evacuated. And there have been reports of people from that town saying they're never going back. And they are very much exposed to attacks from Hezbollah, which have been occurring on an almost daily basis since October 7th. So Israel's got a real problem in terms of continuing for a prolonged period of time of maintaining the system of oppression and apartheid. So that's just the demographic issue. But we can get into the military aspects as well, which are obviously quite important.
Well, let's talk about the military aspects because they've been front and center for over a month and a half now. Let's talk about that.
Well, first of all, you have an army, an Israeli army, which has not been engaged in serious ground combat since the Lebanese War in 2006. So this is the first time where there's been a serious challenge from a military force or forces in ground combat, sustained ground combat since that time. So we're talking about 18 years. In the 2006 war, I mean, any objective observer, military observer, I think would agree that this was a humiliation for Israel. Israel sent up to 30,000 troops into South Lebanon, and they were pushed back, effectively forced to retreat by no more than 1,000 Hezbollah fighters south of the Litani River in southern Lebanon. And they sustained very significant casualties. They lost a lot of armored vehicles. And they demanded at the time of their retreat that Hezbollah be disarmed. But in fact, Hezbollah was not only not disarmed, it became much stronger in two respects at least. Its missile arsenal, which was estimated to consist at that time of approximately 15,000 missiles, grew tenfold to 150,000 missiles or more. The sophistication of those missiles has increased considerably. And in addition, Hezbollah was engaged in a brutal, protracted war in Syria on the side of Bashar al-Assad and successfully defeated a number of jihadist groups who were in the areas, operating in or near areas bordering Lebanon. And so these are very seasoned, experienced combat troops that Hezbollah has. I believe now they're in the range of 50,000. And Hassan Nasrallah, I think he claimed at one point, which I don't know is true or not, but that they had up to 100,000 fighters. So these, just the missile arsenal alone that Hezbollah possesses, putting aside the skills and experience from a combat perspective of their troops, they have the capacity to overwhelm the Iron Dome air defense system of Israel. They could flatten Haifa. I mean, this is a very, very serious threat to Israel. And they have, in fact, inflicted, without coming remotely close to deploying their full arsenal against Israel over the last 2 months, significant casualties in the northern parts of the country. In Gaza, you have a Hamas force, which consists of an estimated 30,000 fighters. These people, I mean, these soldiers really have nothing to lose at this stage. Regis, these are people who have been trapped in an open air concentration camp for nearly 20 years. They have been deprived in many respects of the essentials of life. Their dignity has been taken away from them. They've been subjected to repeated bombardment. They're fighting on territory, on land which they know intimately well, and over decades have built up a very elaborate, sophisticated tunnel system. So you've got this army, the Israeli army, which is not experienced in combat the way the Hamas fighters and the Hezbollah fighters are experienced, confronting a very formidable military arsenal, dealing with soldiers who really have nothing to lose at this stage. And its conscripts, the Israeli army's conscripts, are people, frankly, who are accustomed to a much more comfortable life. And they've been taken out of the, they called up hundreds of thousands of reservists in Israel, and they've been taken out of the economy, and the economy is suffering very significantly. And so there's the economic aspects of this. But on top of all of this, you have militant groups attacking American military bases, and American military support is essential to Israel in Iraq and Syria. And you have the Houthis in Yemen firing ballistic missiles and drones towards Israel, and now seizing civilian vessels that are Israeli owned. So when you add it all up, Israel is at serious risk. And I think October 7th demonstrated just how vulnerable it actually is. You're talking here about a force of some 1,500 Palestinian militants who were equipped with nothing more than small arms. They overran 4 Israeli military bases. They destroyed a division. They killed numerous senior officers. I mean, the focus understandably has been upon civilians who were allegedly killed by these militants. Uh, but that has taken away, drawn attention in the West away from the military aspects of what happened on October 7th. And what happened on October 7th was actually rather remarkable, and I think demonstrated that even just against Hamas, let's put aside for a moment Hezbollah, Israel is very vulnerable militarily. So I think that the combination, and this is the point that I'm the central thesis of my articles, the combination of economic pain, military vulnerability, um, diplomatic isolation, and the growing, I would say, concern of the U.S. government with the domestic political aspects of its support for Israel, its international standing, and its own vulnerability to attack in the Middle East will ultimately result in Israel's strategic defeat if this continues to be waged at the military level.
Okay, a couple of questions, Dimitri. You mentioned the PLO's formidable 160,000 missiles in their arsenal. My question is, why haven't they unleashed the fury of this as they witnessed the unleashed fury of Netanyahu's IDF against Gaza? Why haven't they not used it to put an end to it?
Well, you said PLO, Regis. I take it you were referring.
Hezbollah,
Yeah,
Hezbollah.
right. So, look, there are 2 aircraft carrier battle groups that have been sent to the Mediterranean. Israel itself has both the ability and the willingness, as it's demonstrated in prior attacks on Lebanon, to inflict massive suffering on the civilian population. And Hezbollah Hezbollah is, despite all that's said about it, its leadership, I think, is genuinely concerned about the impacts upon the Lebanese people of a full-scale war with Israel. And the phrase that I would use, borrow it, not it's not. I'm not the person who coined it. I'm borrowing the phrase from Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector. What Hezbollah is engaged in is a very skillful game, or not. I wouldn't call it a game, but an exercise in escalation management. So it's gradually ratcheting up the pain on Israel, but keeping the level of warfare restrained enough that Israel doesn't unleash the full fury of its own arsenal on the Lebanese civilian population. Having said that, though, Hezbollah has made clear that it's not going to allow the destruction of Hamas. And I don't think that Hezbollah is the kind of organization that bluffs. If they feel that Hamas is seriously at risk of being destroyed, and Israel itself has admitted that out of some 30,000 fighters, with all the carnage in Gaza over the past 2 months, it's only killed somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 Hamas fighters. One wonders whether even those figures can be relied upon, given the Israeli government's extensive and sordid record of dishonesty. But let's suppose that's true. Hamas is nowhere close to collapse at this stage. So why would Hezbollah bring upon the civilian population of Lebanon the extraordinary pain of a full-blown Israeli assault when it's not necessary to do that in order to protect Hamas? And I think there's a political aspect to this as well, Regis, and Hassan Nasrallah spoke about this in his speech. The Palestinian people are fighting for their own survival and dignity, and this is their conflict. They initiated it. All the resistance groups, it's not just Hamas, it's not just Islamic Jihad, others such as the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine are involved in this struggle. And they ultimately want to claim this victory as their own, if indeed they do prevail. And so I think that Hezbollah's, from a political perspective, is inclined to allow the Palestinian people and encourage the Palestinian people to take the lead in this struggle, and only to intervene on a massive scale if it's necessary for them to do so.
Okay, well, I think this is another example of indigenous people fighting for the right of self determination, a free and open society. Where have we seen it? We've seen it everywhere, from Vietnam, even Korea. We've seen it in Afghanistan. My God, 20 years there to weaken and destroy the Taliban, and America pulls out, and the Taliban is stronger than ever, and they take over. And so I think you're making a really important point about indigenous people fighting for their right to survive and to exist. And that has proven, I think, over the last number of decades to be more powerful than the most powerful army the world's ever seen, supposedly in the United States of America. I
Mhm.
want to get back to something that's very important in terms of the conflict. I'm reading again today multiple stories revealing now that Israel knew as much as a year ago. And they continued to dismiss it for a number of reasons. Primarily, I think, because they thought there was no way that Hamas could possibly do that. They felt so arrogant. Um, anyway, it's coming out again that this was a 9/11, that Israel allowed it to happen. Uh, I have a hard time believing that. And I know with what Scott Ritter has reported, and what you've been saying, this was not a terrorist attack. This was a well planned military counteroffensive against everything that's been happening for the last decades. What are your thoughts?
It has to be said over and over again, unfortunately, although it shouldn't, that an occupied people has a right to employ armed resistance to achieve their freedom. This should be non-controversial in the West, but in the West, we readily, in the mainstream discourse, uh, conflate attacks by Palestinian militants on Israeli military personnel with attacks by Palestinian militants on unarmed civilians. There's a critical legal and moral distinction between those two things. I mean, it just as a moral proposition, we should readily accept that people who are being subjected for decades to brutal oppression have the right to take up arms against their oppressor. And that's what the Palestinian people have done over and over and over again. There, of course, have been cases, numerous cases, where um, the some persons acting on their own initiative, Palestinians acting on their own initiative, sometimes members of militant organizations like Hamas, like Islamic Jihad, have actually employed deadly force against the civilian population. That is unlawful. That is illegal. I myself condemn it, as I do in the cases of all targeting of civilian persons by militant groups, however just their grievances may be. But the fact remains that as long as they focus their attacks, and that doesn't mean there won't be any civilian casualties. They focus their attacks upon military targets, and if there are, because international law does accept that within military conflict there will be civilian deaths, and civilian deaths are not ipso facto illegal. It depends. It depends on the circumstances in which they died. Were they targeted? Were they specifically the object of the military assault? Were reasonable steps taken to prevent their being killed? The very arguments that Israel employs so disingenuously to justify the massive slaughter of civilians, why aren't those same arguments available to its opponents when they kill Israeli militants or Israeli civilians in the course of battle? But having said that, there's a real question here about how many civilians were in fact targeted and killed by Hamas. I'm sure there were, or at least by persons who participated in the October 7th attacks, who may or may not have been members of Hamas. There certainly were a number of civilians who were killed. But it's clear from Israel's own numbers that that number was well under 1,000, because of the 1,200 reported Israeli deaths, nearly 400, according to Israel's own statements, were military, police, and security services. So that leaves somewhere around 800, and there have been testimonies that have emerged and video evidence that has emerged, uh, substantiating that a significant number of the Israeli civilians who were killed in the crossfire by Israeli Apache helicopters, tanks, and ground troops firing at Hamas militants who were holding hostages. So when you compare that figure, whatever it is, it's undoubtedly less than, again, assuming the Israelis are telling the truth about the overall casualties, it's less than 800 to what has happened in Gaza. It is preposterous, utterly preposterous to claim that Hamas was targeting civilians, but that Israel isn't. We're talking now in excess of 6,000 Palestinian children in 2 months. So this is, some 7 to 8 times larger than the total number of civilians, adult and child civilians, killed by Hamas reportedly. And on top of that, thousands of women in Gaza have been killed by Israel, and thousands of men who are not Hamas militants. Only a small, as I say, according to Israel itself, 1 to 2,000 of some 20,000 casualties are Hamas militants. And so we're to believe that Hamas targeted civilians, but Israel isn't targeting civilians. In any event, in terms of, the point of, this question about whether this was anticipated by Israel, I'm sure that there was, reporting. There were a recent report came out that, female Israeli soldiers near the border of Gaza were reporting unusual drone activity in the months and weeks leading up to the October 7th attacks. And of course, I think as you and I discussed the first time when we were together and talking about this subject, the Egyptian government reported that it warned Netanyahu's government at the highest levels that Hamas was preparing a large-scale attack prior to October 7th. I don't yet believe that this was something which the Israeli government allowed to happen. I don't doubt for 1 second it's capable of doing such a thing. I think it's capable of anything, frankly, at this stage. It's proven that in spades. But I think what is more plausible is that the Israeli government, as you say, held the Palestinian resistance in such low regard that it didn't believe it could ever seriously mount a large-scale attack successfully. And as something we've seen in abundance in the Ukraine war, the West tends to, and this would include Israel, place far too much confidence in its weaponry and the technological sophistication of its weaponry. Human ingenuity, despite all the technology at Israel's disposal, human ingenuity can result in very effective military operations, even against a very technologically sophisticated opponent with massive destructive power at its disposal. We've seen this again and again. You mentioned the case of Afghanistan, Regis. This was the entirety of NATO. The entirety of NATO waged war against the Taliban for 2 decades. The Taliban had virtually nothing other than Soviet-era small arms at its disposal. And with all of the sophisticated weaponry that NATO deployed in that conflict, it was ultimately defeated and forced to flee the country in shame. So a determined insurgent army, a skillful, determined, desperate insurgent army will always pose a formidable opponent to any military force, including the armies of the West.
All right. I want to shift our attention back to the citizens of Israel. For however many years it is now, 70 years, Israel has been attracting Jews from around the world to come live there, to come live, to come work, and to build up a successful modern state. You have written that the attack on October 7th has probably made these people aware of their vulnerability. And you also have written, and I want you to expand on that a bit, that Israel has long marketed itself as the global sanctuary of the Jewish people. In light of what's happened, in light of what we're saying, is this not a serious question? I mean, you just mentioned a few minutes ago how many Israelis you saw in Greece. Uh, so tell me a little bit more about how that is working and what that's likely to lead to.
I remember quite clearly a number of years ago. I can't remember the exact year. There was a horrific terrorist attack in France targeting Jewish persons, and Netanyahu went to Paris and to the uh, shall we say uh, anger of the French government at the time. I think it may have been the government of François Hollande. Uh, he basically told the Jewish population of France that they should come to Israel because they'll be safer there. He was encouraging them to leave France. Um, and this is just one of the more sort of aggressive examples of how the Israeli government has sought to attract immigration to Israel from the Jewish diaspora. Looking at this now, I mean, any sensible person's watching what's happening on the ground in Israel. I mean, yesterday or the day before, there was an attack in Jerusalem itself, in which Hamas militants shot some 15 persons. I believe they were standing at a bus stop. The last report I saw, 4 of them have died. A number of them are critically injured, sadly. Um, we mentioned. I mentioned what happened militarily on October 7th. It wasn't just that they overran 4 military bases. They actually briefly controlled, these militants, of a number of communities bordering on Gaza. You have Kiryat Shimona being evacuated in the north, and probably some dozens of other small communities being evacuated. So if you're sitting in a place like Brooklyn or Paris or Frankfurt, Los Angeles, you're Jewish and you're looking at this situation, are you honestly going to feel safer in Israel than you feel where you are now? Or if you're one of the many Israeli citizens who has dual citizenship and also has citizenship in a Western country, are you not going to be asking yourself, perhaps I'd be safer over there than I am here? Of course, people are going to be asking themselves this question. And there's not only the question of safety and security, Regis, there's a question of the standing, the moral and international standing of Israel itself. What person of conscience would want to be associated with a country which is brazenly committing a genocide before the eyes of the world, which has become a rogue state in every conceivable sense, which respects no law, which engages in the most heinous forms of barbarism against a defenseless civilian population, massacres thousands of children, openly declares its intent to kill children, to kill civilians en masse and drive them into the Sinai? What person of conscience would want to be a citizen of this country? I know people who lived in Israel and who've left Israel. I personally know them. A number of them have gone to live in Europe. A number of them have gone to the United States or Canada. They don't want to live there anymore because they're ashamed of what Israel has become. And they're entirely right to feel ashamed about what Israel has become. So Israel is neither a physical sanctuary nor is it a moral sanctuary for the Jewish people. And it should have been foreseen by the creators of this country from the very outset that this was going to happen, that it wasn't going to be the sanctuary that it was built to be, that it was going to be a place that would become increasingly unsafe for the Jewish people, because Israel is founded on a profound injustice of Western colonizers coming to a land that was already populated for centuries by indigenous Palestinians. And it was built on the notion that the colonizers had the right, the legal and moral right, to dispossess these people by violence of their land and their other resources, such as water. Anybody could have foreseen that this was unsustainable and that this was going to result in extreme and protracted violence. And this is going to have profound long-term consequences for Israel strategically, this growing realization that Israel is neither a physical nor a moral sanctuary for the Jewish people.
Okay. What are the outcomes? How's this going to end? You listed and analyzed 4. The first was Israel's external enemies intervene militarily, and Israel describes itself as being surrounded by enemies. Uh, Talk to me a little bit about that first outcome and the likelihood of it.
I think it's inevitable if this continues. If so, it seems to me fairly clear, and I'm not the only person who's come to this conclusion, that to the extent Israel has any plan at all, the plan is to render Gaza so unlivable that it forces uh, its 2 million plus inhabitants into the Sinai or causes other governments to take them into various other jurisdictions and basically cleanse Gaza ethnically of all Palestinians. I think that to the extent it has a plan, that's the plan. And the closer it gets to realizing that plan, the more likely it will be that Hezbollah will unleash the full fury of its arsenal upon Israel. And then we may well see Iran enter the fray. And Iran has a much more destructive and formidable missile arsenal than even Hezbollah has. If both Hezbollah and Iran let's just leave aside all these other players. Let's pretend that Egypt doesn't become forced to intervene militarily. Turkey doesn't intervene militarily. Jordan doesn't intervene militarily. Syria doesn't intervene militarily. And the way things are going, any one of them could potentially be forced eventually to intervene in some way militarily. Let's just focus on Hezbollah and Iran. Together, they have the ability to flatten large parts of Israel, to inflict upon Israel so much damage that it never recovers, certainly not in our lifetimes. Um, and the extremity of what Israel is doing is such that you may see military intervention from more than Hezbollah and Iran. This small country on the Mediterranean could not survive attacks on that scale. I think that that's just obvious. I mean, even Hamas's relatively primitive arsenal of rockets, small, unsophisticated rockets, overwhelmed the Iron Dome defense system on October 7th. They fired so many rockets that they actually were able to inflict significant damage on the infrastructure of Israel, despite the presence of the Iron Dome system. Imagine if both Hezbollah and Iran were to saturate Israel with missile attacks. They'd have no hope whatsoever of defending themselves through the Iron Dome air defense system.
You mentioned the two aircraft carriers, United States aircraft carrier groups are off the coast. Do you think that the United States would be foolish enough to enter into the fray, given the fact that those admirals know that those aircraft carriers are sitting ducks to missiles that Hamas, Hezbollah, and certainly Iran has?
Well, I don't know that Hezbollah has the ability to inflict any damage upon those aircraft carriers, but Hezbollah has fairly sophisticated anti-ship missiles. And I'm not sure exactly what the range of its drones are, but it could potentially swarm American military vessels with drones. And of course, Iran has very sophisticated missile capacity, anti-ship missiles. Plus, it has a significant naval force, and it has the ability to basically bring to a halt oil shipments in the Gulf with its military capacity, which would have absolutely devastating impacts on Western economies. It would cause the price of oil to soar. Notwithstanding all of that, I think the American government would unquestionably intervene militarily if it were to feel that Israel were confronting an existential danger. It would attack Iran. It would attack Lebanon. I have no doubt it would do that. Whether it would send ground troops, that I'm skeptical about. But would it launch large-scale missile attacks and bomb relentlessly both Lebanon and Iran? Yes, it would. But the cost to the United States of doing that, not just economically, but militarily. I mean, Iran, for example, has very sophisticated air defense systems. Hezbollah may also have some air defense systems, but I know with a high level of confidence that Iran does. And so it would be able to inflict serious damage on the the combat aircraft and the bombers of the American military. You know, its own naval vessels may come under attack, devastating attack. The economic repercussions would be severe. So, if the United States did choose to become involved in a significant scale militarily, at the end of the day, um, I don't know that there would be any winners in this. I really doubt that the Americans would emerge the clear victor. I think what would happen more likely is that there would just be death and destruction all over the Middle East. Israel would lie in smoking ruins. The American economy would be severely damaged, and the American military itself would sustain significant losses. It would just be a scene of destruction and suffering such as we haven't seen in the Middle East, despite all the tragedies we've experienced there thus far.
Okay, outcome number two. The Gulf states use economic coercion against the West. What do you mean by that?
They stopped selling oil and gas to Europe and the United States and other allies of the West, such as Japan. And so if they were to do that again, you know, here in Canada in the third quarter, there was a contraction, an economic contraction. Europe is experiencing economic stagnation. It's already, parts of it are already reeling, particularly Germany, from the drastic reduction in the supply of Russian oil and gas. You know, unemployment is on the rise. The financial systems in the West are in a very fragile condition. We've seen some major bank failures in the United States. So the last thing that the Western economies need right now, frankly, is an oil price shock. So it's really just a question of whether they're willing to pull that trigger. And again, given the extremity of what Israel is doing, it may well be that even those governments of the Middle East, the governments of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, which has, by the way, severed diplomatic relations with Israel, their hand may be forced, and they may be compelled to adopt economic coercion as a way of bringing this to an end. If they were to do that, I think that this would put enormous pressure on the Biden. And let's remember that Biden is heading into an election next year. He's already floundering. He's already lost the Arab American vote, is very unlikely to prevail in the swing state of Michigan. The polls are showing that Trump, despite all of his baggage, is leading Biden. What are Biden's electoral prospects going to be if the United States, economy goes into the toilet in the months leading up to the election? I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to understand or to appreciate that the Biden administration must be very concerned about this. So this is a real leverage point for Middle Eastern governments. The question is whether they have the political and economic will to pull that trigger. As I say, if the situation on the ground becomes even worse and persists for months to come, the domestic pressure on these governments to do this, to use that economic leverage, will be enormous and quite possibly irresistible.
Yeah. And I would think that this could be the fastest way to end this thing overnight. All they have to do is turn off the spigot. All right. Outcome number three. You've done a good job in thinking through these, but number three that you listed was Israel negotiates a ceasefire and an exchange of hostages after failing to destroy Hamas. That could be really complicated for people like Netanyahu and the people in Israel. But tell me a little bit about how you think that might come out.
On a small scale, that's already happened. Netanyahu was saying from the very beginning, there will be no pause whatsoever in the destruction we are inflicting upon Gaza until all of the hostages have been released. Well, after almost 2 months of heinous carnage, what did Netanyahu's government do? It entered into a truce, which was extended 2 or 3 times for a week, allowed some humanitarian aid to enter into Gaza, and gave up 3 times as many hostages as Hamas did. And Hamas throughout this entire period, the week that just went by, didn't release a single military hostage. And these are the ones that are going to be, I think, most difficult for Israel to recover. But Israel has already shown weakness. There's been a crack in the wall of Israeli determination by entering into this truce after the maximalist statements made by Netanyahu at the beginning. No pause in the fighting unless all hostages are released. By Israel's estimate, there's another 137 of them in the custody of Hamas. And as far as I can tell, the vast majority of them are military personnel. So what is going to happen, let's say the fighting, they've resumed the bombardment of Gaza. Let's suppose that this goes on for another month. The Israeli economy continues to suffer severe damage. They continue to suffer significant casualties in Gaza, the Israeli military, and on the border with Lebanon. Some of the hostages being held by Hamas have been killed. Some were already killed by Israeli bombardment. Others are killed. And there's no end in sight to this war because Hamas's military structures remain largely intact, which I think is likely going to be the case about a month from now if this continues. Well, the pressure, already Netanyahu is under intense pressure to secure the release of the other hostages. That pressure is going to increase. The economic pressure is going to increase. The Israeli military is going to become weaker. And so I think one very possible outcome of these various, all of these scenarios we've discussed thus far, in my view, are realistic possibilities. This one is certainly a realistic possibility. And if that happens, that ultimately it releases Israel thousands of the hostages it holds, and that's what they are. They're hostages. And in exchange for the remaining 137 hostages held by Hamas, and Israel enters into a permanent ceasefire, at least a semi-permanent ceasefire, this image that it's projected for decades of invulnerability will be destroyed. Its international standing will lie in tatters. It's going to be an international pariah. And it will have created a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza such as we've never seen in this part of the world. And that will function as a sort of constant reminder to the world of Israeli brutality and depravity. So Israel would be in a very, very bad place if it was forced into that kind of a situation. Now, I'll tell you, Regis, I think that the Israeli government has painted itself into a corner here. There's no off ramp here that's attractive. All roads lead to a strategic defeat.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think they've already lost. Just a matter of how much time they are able to and have the will to continue, given everything you just mentioned. All right, outcome number 4. Israel is forced by popular outrage. Where? Internally? Externally around the world, they're already facing that. But to negotiate a ceasefire and an exchange for hostages. That seems very close to outcome number 3, but except for the popular outrage. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, the scenario number 3 we just talked about was pressure resulting from domestic demands of the domestic population for the release of the hostages and economic and military damage. The 4th scenario I'm talking about really is external popular support, popular outrage. And so I'll just talk about what's going on in this country. I've been very active in not just the cause of Palestinian human rights, but other human rights causes in this country for many years. I've never seen anything like what we're witnessing right now. Politicians across the political spectrum, but particularly from the governing Liberal Party, they can barely show their faces in public without being shamed and named. We had an incident recently, which was widely publicized in Canada, where Justin Trudeau was dining in a chic restaurant in Vancouver on the West Coast, and Palestinian solidarity protesters came in and were shouting at him that he was complicit in genocide. And he ended up leaving the restaurant. He went to another restaurant. They followed him there and continued to harangue him at that restaurant. Ministers, every time they appear in public in this country, they're heckled. and accused of complicity in genocide. There have been massive protests over and over and over again. The offices of members of parliament are being occupied by activists on a regular basis. So we're seeing, and this experience that we're having here in Canada is also unfolding in the United States. And despite protest bans in countries like Germany and France, we're seeing it unfold in Europe. And I think right now, these are governments that were already in serious trouble because of the Ukraine debacle, this historical debacle that they engineered, and which is clearly leading to the strategic defeat of NATO in Ukraine. They're very politically vulnerable. And when you see unprecedented and persistent levels of civil disobedience happening, as we're witnessing here in the West, I think it's a realistic possibility that the governments of the West would finally just say, we've had enough of this. And they tell Israel, you've got to stop. You've got to stop. You've got to do a deal to get those hostages free, even if it means releasing thousands of Palestinian hostages that you've held for years. And you need to sit down at the table and negotiate a durable peace with the Palestinian people. That is certainly a realistic possibility because of the unprecedented public outrage we're seeing in the West.
Okay, my last question for this session, and we will certainly have many more as this continues to unfold. What is the real solution? Do you believe it's a two-state solution? It's obvious that the United States and Israel have not wanted that ever. They've done everything to make that not possible. I mean, look what we have today. The Palestinians have no rights, according to the United States and Israel. Or is it a one-state solution where they both have equal rights? I don't know, Dimitri. What are your thoughts? Because I don't see much hope.
Well, the international consensus has been for decades that Israel should withdraw to the 1967 borders, and that Palestine should consist of, the territories of the West Bank and Gaza along the 1967 borders, with Jerusalem as the shared capital of Israel and Palestine, the state of Palestine. This has been endorsed in dozens of UN General Assembly and Security Council resolutions. There was one that was passed, by the way, just a few weeks ago or a few days ago, calling in the UN General Assembly, calling for Israel to withdraw to the 1967 borders. This is a long line of resolutions. And interestingly, by the way, it passed with 91 votes in favor, including those of Russia and China. 65 states approximately abstained. They were almost all from the West, and 8 states voted against it. Only 8. Of course, the US and Israel were 2 of them, and the third one was Canada. And then there were a smattering of tiny island states that are dominated by the United States that also voted. I mean, I call these the rogues gallery of, states that purport to support a two-state solution, but in fact don't support it in any way, shape, or form. So that's the international consensus. If Israel were to comply with the international consensus, we would have a two-state solution. The problem, of course, quite apart from the fact that the current Israeli political mainstream, I'm choosing my words carefully here. It's not just Likud. It's not just the party of Benjamin Netanyahu. It's also, the other so-called mainstream parties in Israeli politics have absolutely no interest in allowing the Palestinian people to have a state. So there's a political obstacle, a very formidable one. But there's also a practical obstacle, and that is that the West Bank now has so many settlements in it. I believe the number of illegal Israeli settlers is 800,000 or so. That's a very substantial proportion of the population of the West Bank. They have taken by brute force much of the most fertile land. They are taking a grossly disproportionate share of the already scarce water resources of the West Bank. They have their own separate road system. how do you actually create in that environment, practically speaking, a viable Palestinian state? And now you have Gaza, of course, lying in ruins, and it's only going to get worse in the days and weeks ahead. So as a practical reality, Regis, I don't know that the international consensus could be achieved at this stage. And that means one thing and one thing only, and that is that Israel is going to have to, and this will happen. I believe this is going to happen, and it's going to happen in our lifetimes. Israel will be forced, one way or another, whether it's a two-state or one-state solution, to give the Palestinian people equal rights. If they do that within the context of a one-state solution, they are very likely going to lose. They will no longer be in a position demographically in order to dominate the politics of that state, whatever it may be called, whether it's called Israel or Palestine or something else. They're going to be outnumbered. And that's just a reality that sooner or later they're going to have to accept. There are ways to structure this state that will protect the rights of it. And I can understand, I can certainly understand if I were a Jewish Israeli citizen, given the level of enmity there now is between the two peoples, I would be concerned about living in a state where the majority of the population is Palestinian. But you can construct the state in such a way as to give these people, the Jewish Israeli population, legal protections. You can have a Bill of Rights, which protects majority rights, and an independent judiciary. You can have some kind of bicameral state, or a state that's comprised of two statelets. So it's really one political unit, but within that political unit, there are two subunits that each of which protects the members of their own constituencies. So there's a number of ways politically and legally in which you can construct a one state that is adequately protective of everybody. And I think ultimately, because of what Israel has done to the West Bank with these extensive settlements, this is probably the way this is going to have to go. This is going to be an enormously difficult thing for a lot of Israelis to accept. There's a tremendous amount of anti-Palestinian racism in Israeli society. But it happened in South Africa. There was a tremendous amount of anti-Black racism amongst the white elite of South Africa. And for decades, they dominated the Black South African indigenous population. And ultimately, they had to accept that they would live within a state, a majority of whose citizens and voters were Black. And that's exactly what the Israeli Jewish population is going to have to accept. And the sooner they accept it, the better off everybody will be, including the Jewish citizens of Israel.